Good evening, everyone from Australia. My name is Abida Sultana. I am a full-time doctoral student at the Western Sydney University, and thank you so much for providing this opportunity to present my paper. So the focus of my thesis is to re-examine the unfairness of international trading regime and to critically review the ever-present protectionist interest in the global trading regime, and to understand the trade effects on the exports of developing countries of environmental measures and other technical measures and regulations by the governments of developed members and private bodies, and to analyze to what extent such measures might have affected the market access for developing countries. So non-tariff barriers are government measures or policy instruments other than tariffs that determine the extent to which a product has got access to import market. For example, measures to protect food safety or measures to protect health or the environment or to conserve exhaustible natural resources. For today's presentation, my paper will focus on the interface between the objectives of liberalized international trade and sustainable developments only, as these have become extremely crucial to international policymaking, especially from the perspective of least developed countries. I'll start with a brief presentation about the historical analysis. I'll go to the next slide. The GATT had been the single most influential organization in setting the trade agenda and the direction for international trade for more than half a century. However, history tells us that since the inception of GATT in 1947, the prevalent use of non-tariff trade barriers for the protection of agriculture in the industrialized nations had been detrimental to the terms of trade performance of developing countries, especially for least developed countries. Then in the late 1960s and early 1970s, widespread public interest and awareness towards public health and environmental issues surfaced across Western countries, introducing several health and safety and environmental regulations with the potential to obstruct free trade. It wasn't until the late 1980s and early 1990s when broad range of trade issues and disputes arose over health and conservation regulations. For example, the famous tuna dolphin disputes and most notably the beef hormone case between the United States and the EC. Against this backdrop, the World Trade Organization was established in 1994. And at the conclusion of the Uruguay round in 1994, members of the WTO, they adopted the agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures, as in the SPS agreement. The SPS agreement, on one hand, recognizes the legitimate right of WTO members to protect human, animal, and plant life or health and the environment, and to establish an appropriate level of protection as they consider necessary. But on the other hand, sets forth several general requirements to ensure that SPS measures are not used by WTO members as a non-tariff barriers to trade. However, an in-depth literature review of international trade showcases that with the reduction of traditional market barriers negotiated during the Uruguay round trade talks, a new wave of protectionism has surfaced with the proliferation of increasingly diverse and complex instruments, especially environmental measures, that has significantly impacted export-oriented sectors of lower-income countries. Recent data shows that developing countries incur a loss of around $23 billion per year, which is equivalent to 10% of the total exports to G20 nations due to non-compliance with G20 non-tariff measures. The upward trend of legalizing non-tariff barriers within the rule-based structure of the World Trade Organization has raised complex regulatory questions in the context of developed versus developing nations asymmetries. That leads to the question of the credibility and the future role of the multilateral trading system. Before I move into that discussion, two different viewpoints need to be briefly discussed at this stage. First of all, WTO has been dubbed as insensitive and unsympathetic to the emerging environmental challenges by many environmental groups NGOs, and academics. Green advocates even argue that WTO should not only ensure free and equitable trade, but also uphold the core values of its preamble, conducting trade in accordance with the objective of sustainable development. They suggest that WTO system and its dispute settlement mechanism cannot survive and maintain its legality if it continues to value free trade above all other social goals and ecological concerns. On the other side, several concerns have been raised by developing country governments, civil society groups, and academic commentators about the growing impact of trade restricting standards and regulations on the regulatory function of governments. Developing countries argue that WTO, because of its narrow trade focus, lacks the jurisdiction and the competence and the capacity to handle the multifaceted problems posed by trade and environment. They also argue that developing countries cannot be forced to comply with those rules and laws that have not been accepted and approved by all the member states. It is interesting to see how far WTO has moved from its original status of being a multilateral trade organization and has taken the policies and interests that are outside the ambit of trade liberalization much more seriously than its predecessor GATT. The rationale behind this could be attributable to the pace of development, rapidly expanding economies, and the growing awareness of the environment and other social values. On many occasions, the WTO appellate body have also recognized the need for balancing trade and environmental protection. However, WTO members need to recognize that while the GATT Article 20, the SPS agreement, and the TBT agreements allow member states to have their own sets of rules and regulations to protect environment or to conserve exhaustible natural resources, it is also necessary that such measures are not applied in an arbitrary or unjustifiable manner or constitute a disguised restriction on international trade. So in order to reconcile the positions of developing and developed countries, painstaking efforts were made that resulted in a successful ministerial conference in Doha back in November 2001. The underlying strength of the WTO Doha Development Agenda was to allow developing and especially least developed countries to engage more prominently in wider negotiations that would cater to their priorities in exchange for concessions in other areas. Sadly, after 14 years of talks, members of the WTO have effectively ended the Doha round of negotiations in 2015. Failure to achieve this ambitious agenda of Doha development negotiations has undermined the credibility of the multilateral trading system. And interestingly, the problem is compounded by the proliferation of large preferential and regional trade agreements such as TTIP and TPP, which are structurally aligned with developed country trade and regulatory characteristics. These agreements are likely to have detrimental effects on the flexibility offered within the WTO to developing countries and to LDCs. The abandonment of the Doha Development Agenda entails that developed countries are now less compelled to engage in negotiations of importance to LDCs. So now, what is the future of the multilateral trading system? The WTO is one of the most powerful intergovernmental organizations that has ever emerged. The WTO has to some extent contributed in reducing decades-long trade barriers, particularly tariff. At the same time, the WTO has been criticized as it has not quite been successful to comprehend one of the ambitious objectives of its architects, as mentioned in the introductory paragraph of the WTO agreement. There is need for positive efforts designed to ensure that developing countries, and especially the least developed among them, secure a share in the growth in international trade commensurate with the needs of their economic development. It is not surprising that in recent years, more and more countries have recognized the importance of the crucial relationship between trade and the environment. Environmentalists, NGOs, and several academics, they have relentlessly pushed for the legitimization of trade-related environmental measures that achieve real outcomes. In upcoming decades, debates over trade restrictive domestic environmental measures may increase, and these debates will definitely challenge the fulfillment of the core objectives of the WTO agreement, as I stated a bit earlier. So reconciliation of trade and environmental issues will not just require transfer of technologies and trade-related technical assistance and funding. In order to truly achieve the sustainable development goals and realize the benefits for all people across all the countries, rather than just for some privileged nations, will require sincere and serious efforts to understand the relationship between the social, environmental, and economic aspects of human life on a case-by-case basis, on a sector-by-sector, on a country-by-country, and on a region-by-region basis across countries at immensely different stages of development and with different social, economic, and environmental features. As we all understand, the pandemic has widened inequalities within national economies and across countries. In a keynote address on sustainable development earlier this week, WTO Director General Dr. Ngozi noted that reducing inequalities of all kinds is at the core of the Sustainable Development Goals. So, in view of the evident unfairness and injustice of the status quo, we need a multilateral trading system with fair and equitable rules of play and provisions for least developed countries in particular to remedy the embedded injustice in the system. Thank you so much for having me.